I never imagined that moving to a quiet suburb would lead me to wage a miniature war against a single, obstinate individual. My name is Dr. Alexandra Alex Bishop, and I happen to be a chief epidemiologist at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Though my job is demanding, especially in times when novel infections spread unpredictably, I decided to purchase a house in the serene Willow Glen Estates, hoping for respite from ceaseless lab work and bureaucratic challenges. I wanted a simple life after hours, neighbors waving hello, kids riding bicycles, lawns immaculately trimmed. I imagined potluck gatherings and warm welcomes. It started well enough. My home was a comfortable two-story with a wraparound porch, perched near a row of tall pines that separated Willow Glen from a nearby creek. The first weeks were calm. I took my dog, Gibson, on evening walks, strolled past pristinely painted fences, and waved at families as they tended their flower beds. The HOA board members seemed nice at first. A few folks kindly dropped off a welcome to the neighborhood basket. They introduced me to Ms. Brenda Arnett, who, despite her formal introduction, was widely known around town as Karen, a nickname she had earned for reasons that I would soon understand. She was around 50, wearing sharp business casual clothes and sporting a pinched-lipped smile that never quite reached her eyes. She managed to convey her authority without uttering a single direct threat, glancing at every house around mine, as if she were the watchful eye of some invisible higher power. On the first day we met, Karen handed me a huge packet titled Willow Glen Estates Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, before winking conspiratorially and saying, "Don't worry, dear, I'll keep you on track." Back then, I didn't see that as a warning sign. I took it as well-intentioned neighborly advice. Little did I know how quickly circumstances would change. Before I could even finish setting up my living room furniture, I began hearing odd stories. The neighbors spoke in hushed tones about Karen's relentless zeal for keeping the HOA standards. She was known to personally measure the grass lengths in front yards and place orange violation notices on windshields of cars that so much as brushed against a curb. At first, I chalked this up to suburban rumor-mongering. I'd once lived in a condominium that had a fairly strict HOA, so I thought I was prepared. I had no idea of the extremes Karen would reach or how personal it would become. One sunny morning, I was tinkering in my garage, setting up a modest workshop to occasionally fix bicycles or build small wooden planters, when I got a phone call from my colleague at the CDC. A local outbreak of a new respiratory virus, while not severe, was raising concerns. A handful of infections were traced to a nearby college. The conversation was routine. I had been part of many outbreak tracing calls before. We would watch the numbers, potentially advise city officials to isolate certain areas if needed, and coordinate with local health departments. With a sigh, I realized my quiet suburb retreat might be overshadowed by professional responsibilities sooner than I'd hoped. Unbeknownst to me, Karen was lurking outside at that very moment, presumably walking her tiny white Pomeranian, which, ironically, never seemed to be on a leash, another contradiction in an HOA that prided itself on order. The next thing I knew, she was at my door, listening intently as I finished my phone call. At that moment, she had no clue I worked for the CDC. That ignorance wouldn't last long. At the knock on my door, I put away my phone and opened up to see Karen's face, pursed-lipped and brimming with feigned concern. "Everything okay, Ms. Bishop?" she inquired, eyes flicking briefly to the phone in my hand. "I heard you talking about an outbreak or something." Her tone was borderline invasive, as though she believed my phone call was her business to dissect. I forced a polite smile. "I'm fine, Ms. Arnett. Just dealing with some work." Karen's eyes lit up. Yes. Well, don't let any personal crisis distract you from the community guidelines. We all want Willow Glen to remain perfect, after all. And if you need help, you can come to me, of course," she said with an air of insincerity. Her words implied that the rules here were sacrosanct, that a single stray sign or unapproved fence painting would crater property values across Willow Glen. I nodded politely, wishing her a pleasant day. She lingered a moment longer, scanning my yard. Her eyes took in the mailbox, the newly installed porch swing, the style of my window shutters. Then, apparently satisfied that I had no immediate infractions to chastise, she turned on her heel and marched off. That same evening, as I worked on my laptop to draft a preliminary containment suggestion for local authorities, a A pressing message came in from CDC headquarters. The outbreak numbers were more significant than we had hoped. The virus spread surprisingly fast among college dormitories, and a few cases were popping up in the surrounding community. Although it was not a crippling disease with high mortality, the infection's mild symptoms allowed unsuspecting carriers to spread it swiftly. This posed a risk to at-risk populations, particularly the elderly or immunocompromised. My job, then, would be to collaborate with local health agencies on possibly setting up a small quarantine or observation facility. We needed a place where individuals suspected of infection could stay for a short period to prevent the spread while waiting for tests. Normally, such an arrangement would be made in a local hospital or a designated government building. However, the city was strapped for space due to renovations in the main county hospital. So, we were exploring unconventional options, perhaps using a vacant community center or a large hall that could host a small number of people for a few days. The location had to be local and comfortable enough not to provoke panic. Unaware of the monumental headache I was about to endure, I volunteered the idea of using Willow Glen's old recreation center, which was rarely used except for monthly potluck gatherings. It was a modest building at the edge of the neighborhood near the creek, with plenty of space for cots, a working kitchen, and separate restrooms. It also had a large parking lot for medical staff to come and go. We could easily equip it with medical supplies from the city's emergency stockpile. All it would require was cooperation from the HOA. Naively, I thought that a public health crisis would unite everyone behind the cause. I had no illusions that people wanted an infectious disease anywhere near them. But in a mild outbreak requiring short quarantines, having a local facility can do wonders to stop the spread. The convenience alone could reduce the pressure on hospitals. Then again, I hadn't met a real Karen in full force yet. The next day, I arranged a meeting with the Willow Glen HOA board. It consisted of 5 members, including Karen, who played an outsized role in day-to-day issues. The president, Rick Walters, was a mild, balding man in his early 60s who seemed perpetually overwhelmed by Karen's bossy demeanor. 2 other board members, Alicia and Marcus, were more flexible and kind. They had teenage kids and worried about ensuring the neighborhood rules were fair without being overbearing. The last board member was a retiree named Nancy, who rarely spoke but occasionally gave pithy, reasonable feedback in board discussions. I stood in the rec center's large multipurpose room, explaining the CDC's position and the need for an overflow quarantine area. I quickly ran through the basics. The virus's symptoms were predominantly mild, akin to a severe cold or moderate flu. Our aim was to prevent it from reaching immunocompromised seniors and other vulnerable groups. Quarantining suspected carriers for 2 to 3 days, until negative test results were confirmed, was a proactive measure. The presence of professional medical staff and protective equipment would minimize risk to the community. Karen was silent while I explained, her manicured nails drumming on the table. I assumed she was carefully listening. But when I finished, she interjected, "I don't see how that's a good idea. You want to bring infected people into our perfect neighborhood? Hard pass." I tried to keep calm. "I realize it sounds scary, Ms. Arnett, but we're trying to stop the virus from spreading. We can keep the infected population in one secure, monitored place until they're cleared. Otherwise, if they're left to roam or they wait in a crowded hospital, it could escalate. This is about controlling an outbreak." She gave me a thin-lipped smile. "Don't you think we should protect our residents by keeping sick people out entirely? Maybe find some old building across town." There was an edge in her voice, as if she thought I'd find her suggestion logical instead of irresponsible. Rick Walters cleared his throat, looking between us. "Karen, I think Dr. Bishop has a point. This virus is already showing up in the county. If we can manage a safe place for suspected carriers, that's better than letting them wander the streets or wait in the same waiting room as others." Karen glared. "With all due respect, Rick, we can't just turn Willow Glen's rec center into a government ward. This is an HOA, not a hospital. Also, the property values. Can you imagine the headlines? Willow Glen quarantine site, stay away. That would ruin us." She turned to me, the corners of her mouth twitching with annoyance. "I'm sure the CDC can find some other spot. Why must it be here?" This was a critical moment, and I did my best to stay professional. "Ms. Arnett, it doesn't need to be here, but Willow Glen is the most practical option. We have an underused building that meets safety protocols. The county hospital is undergoing renovations, and the city's smaller clinic isn't large enough for this. Our projections show the outbreak could be contained faster if we identify, isolate, and test possible carriers immediately. Please consider that your own vulnerable neighbors, maybe someone with chronic illnesses, would be at far greater risk if we don't isolate cases quickly. Despite my calm tone, Karen didn't budge. But the rest of the board members were more receptive, especially Nancy, who quietly said, "I'd rather have a short-term quarantine in a secure building than let this disease roam uncontained around the city." I'm all for it. Marcus and Alicia also sounded supportive, though they urged me to keep an open line of communication with residents so everyone understood the protocols. Karen frowned deeply, folding her arms. In a formal vote, the board decided 4-1 in favor of temporarily designating the rec center for quarantine if the outbreak continued. Karen was outvoted, but the scowl on her face told me she would not go down without a fight. In the days that followed, I coordinated with the local public health department to prepare Willow Glen's rec center. A small team of nurses arrived to assess the building's viability, measure room dimensions, and plan how to set up isolation cots. We arranged for a portable partition system that could divide the main hall into 4 sections: one for newly arriving individuals, one for confirmed or suspected positives, one for staff, and one for administrative tasks. The parking lot would hold a mobile medical trailer for advanced testing. Surprisingly, many neighbors in Willow Glen were not entirely opposed once I explained the rationale. Several older folks were relieved that if the outbreak arrived at their door, at least there would be immediate testing and isolation measures. Some middle-aged parents, anxious about the virus spreading in school systems, agreed that it was better to have a localized quarantine than a free-for-all. A handful volunteered to help set up chairs, clean surfaces, and donate supplies. It felt like an example of communal solidarity. Under normal circumstances, it would have been heartwarming. Karen, however, refused to see it that way. By the time the rec center was ready for its first day of operation, still quiet, as we had not officially transferred any quarantined individuals yet, Karen had convinced a small faction of residents that my plan would turn Willow Glen into a hotbed of infection. She told them the CDC wanted to stash contagious outsiders in the center of their beloved neighborhood. Under her direction, a petition began circulating that demanded the quarantine site be halted or relocated. Ominous flyers appeared in mailboxes with sensational headlines. "Would you want this virus on your doorstep?" They offered no nuanced data, just fear-mongering bullet points about how property values would plummet if Willow Glen became associated with the outbreak. Tensions rose. Where previously I had cordial chats with neighbors who waved from their driveways, I started encountering more suspicious stares. Some recognized me from Karen's rumor mill. "Oh, you're Dr. Bishop, the one pushing for that thing in the rec center." A fair number still supported me quietly, but an atmosphere of distrust was brewing, fueled by Karen's relentless propaganda. And every day, she became bolder. One evening, I caught Karen taking cell phone pictures of the rec center's front entrance. She was alone, scowling at the large notice posted by the local health department. It explained the guidelines, isolation procedures, and the temporary nature of the project. When Karen saw me approach, her expression curled into a sneer. "You really think you're doing good here, Dr. Bishop?" she asked, pointing at the sign with undisguised contempt. "All you'll accomplish is scaring decent people away. Mark my words, no real estate agent wants to see a hazmat suit in the middle of a suburban street." I mustered the politest response I could. "Ms. Arnett, we're protecting the community. You have a right to disagree, but the decision passed by a majority vote. I'd appreciate your cooperation." "Oh, you'll be seeing more from me, sweetheart," she shot back, her voice laced with venom. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." With that, she marched off, phone in hand, presumably to capture more so-called evidence for her campaign. A sliver of dread stirred in my stomach. Until that moment, I had tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was simply overzealous about property values, or maybe she just didn't understand how disease containment worked. But something in her tone that evening told me she was beyond reason, a person who refused to see facts if they challenged her worldview. I started to realize that my role as a CDC official, ironically, might be less daunting than dealing with one unstoppable Karen. Sure enough, Karen's sabotage escalated. A few nights later, the staff arrived in the morning to find the rec center padlocked. Someone had come during the night and used heavy chains to barricade the front double doors. A bold, handwritten sign read, "Closed by HOA order." I was furious. Of course, the true HOA board had never officially locked the building. The county had recognized it as a designated quarantine site. But Karen had managed to mimic official signage, stamping it with a forged HOA logo. It took half a day to cut those chains. By the time we got inside, we discovered that crucial medical supplies, masks, gloves, cleaning supplies, were missing. Cabinets had been emptied, and a few boxes of personal protective equipment had been slashed with a box cutter. There was no proof Karen herself had done it, but her earlier threats made it all too suspicious. I immediately called the local police department to file a complaint. However, because we had no security cameras or eyewitnesses, the best we could do was label it vandalism. The next step, logically, was to install cameras and a better security system. That took time we couldn't afford to waste. Meanwhile, the outbreak was steadily growing. Not dramatically, but each day new cases emerged in the county. We needed that quarantine center operational, and we needed it safe. The stress weighed heavily on my shoulders. Word of the sabotage spread, and opinions in Willow Glen started to shift again. Many decent neighbors, regardless of how they felt about the quarantine center, did not condone vandalism or sabotage. Even some of Karen's more neutral acquaintances felt she had gone too far. But if she felt any remorse, she didn't show it. Instead, she doubled down on her campaign to have the site shut down entirely, brandishing the vandalism incident as so-called proof that the quarantine center was bringing chaos. "It's just going to cause more crime." "My point exactly," she shrieked at a board meeting. I tried to reason with the HOA that any crime was, ironically, likely from an internal saboteur, someone who shared Karen's stance. She glowered at me from across the table, feigning innocence. Rick Walters cleared his throat nervously. "We're installing security cameras. The rec center remains open under the prior decision. Let's not forget the situation is bigger than Willow Glen. We must help mitigate this outbreak." Rick's voice was shaky but resolute, and for a moment I felt gratitude for his leadership. Karen, though, was not finished. She simply changed her tactics. In the subsequent days, I worked long hours, sometimes not returning home until midnight. My house was only a short walk from the rec center, but I felt under constant siege. Karen pestered me with frequent phone calls or unannounced visits, always with some contrived complaint. "Your grass is half an inch too long," or "your trash cans are placed incorrectly on the curb." I realized she was using petty HOA codes to bombard me with harassment, hoping I'd fold or be too overwhelmed to maintain the quarantine site. But I wouldn't relent. I was used to pressure in my professional life, just never from someone so trivial, yet so relentless. Yet, even I didn't anticipate the extreme measure she was about to take, forcibly shutting the quarantine facility in the midst of actual patients. The day Karen crossed the line from petty sabotage to outright endangerment came when we finally began admitting individuals for quarantine. After a local nursing home had a confirmed positive case, we decided to test all staff and visitors who had close contact there. A few tested positive, others, though negative, needed observation due to the high likelihood of infection. With hospital space limited, we arranged for a handful of them, 8 in total, to stay at the rec center for a short observation period until we were certain they were symptom-free. We set up cots, installed sanitizing stations, placed medical partitions, and established a rotating staff schedule of nurses and aides. The building was locked for safety, with authorized badges for staff. Those inside were not free to wander out into the neighborhood. Indeed, the whole purpose was to keep them isolated if they might be contagious. The staff wore protective gear. It was a carefully managed environment, and for 2 days everything ran smoothly. On the third afternoon, while I was overseeing the distribution of meals, the power suddenly cut off. Emergency lights flickered on, illuminating the rec center in a dim glow. Confused, I hurried to the control room where our staff were trying to figure out the issue. One of the nurses, her face pale, told me, "The power from the main switchboard is dead. It's not a citywide outage. Someone's outside messing with our breaker." Fear gripped me. If the freezers lost power, medications might spoil. We needed electricity to run the negative pressure air filtration we'd installed in one corner. Without those systems, The entire quarantine operation was compromised. I immediately grabbed a face mask and rushed outside. Sure enough, I found Karen by the side of the building, flanked by two equally irate neighbors who had apparently joined her cause. She was fiddling with the external circuit breaker, flipping switches. At the sight of me, she pointed triumphantly. "Stand back, Dr. Bishop," she announced. "The HOA has ordered this facility to close, effective immediately. These people have no right to store contaminants in the heart of our neighborhood." I was appalled. "Ms. Arnett, this is a public health operation authorized by both the local and state governments. You're trespassing on official property." She huffed, her face reddening. "This is HOA property, and we, the homeowners, have decided it's unsafe. So we're shutting it down. You'll have to move your little sick ward someplace else." Before I could respond, two law enforcement officers arrived, alerted by staff who had called for help the moment the power went out. They saw Karen fiddling with the breaker. She tried to claim she was exercising her right as an HOA official, but the officers weren't buying it. One of them was Officer Helena Martinez, a practical woman who had done off-duty security for the center. She recognized me and the seriousness of the facility. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said in a firm tone, "you need to stop immediately. You're interfering with a government-approved medical site." Karen tried to protest. "I'm preventing an even bigger catastrophe. Who knows what viruses they have in there?" The officer shook her head. "I need you to step away right now." Karen seemed ready to argue further, but the second officer placed a hand gently on her shoulder, guiding her away from the breaker box. In the meantime, staff hurried to restore power. My heart hammered as I checked on the quarantined residents inside. If any fragile equipment malfunctioned for too long, it could have endangered them. This wasn't just sabotage, it was a public safety threat. The moment felt surreal. We had a half-dozen quarantined patients who needed calm and stable conditions. Yet Karen was outside flipping the power off in some misguided quest to save the neighborhood. Did she realize how serious this was? Or did she simply not care, so long as she got her way? Either way, the line had been crossed. Karen ended up with a stern warning, but the officers decided to let the matter rest with an incident report, for now. I could almost see the resentment boiling in her eyes as she left the property under police escort, her shoulders stiff with anger. She locked me in a glare that promised future battles. At that moment, I understood I had an outright enemy who would stop at nothing to sabotage the quarantine. And if she had to break the law to do it, she would. Despite Karen's interference, the quarantine continued for about a week, long enough to house a rotating group of individuals who needed observation. Some tested positive and were transferred to a specialized hospital wing in the city once they were confirmed infected, and others left after negative results. Overall, the system worked precisely as intended. The local outbreak remained fairly contained, hospital capacity wasn't overwhelmed, and the quarantined residents received fast care. In short, the plan was succeeding. Behind the scenes, though, Karen was mobilizing every legal and social tactic to shut us down. She pestered City Hall with complaints about zoning violations. She filed formal grievances claiming the rec center wasn't up to code for medical usage. She posted rants on the neighborhood's online forum, painting me, and the CDC as a whole, as a tyrannical force trampling on homeowners' rights. Many recognized her claims as outlandish, but a smaller group swallowed her words, fueling protests on the rec center lawn. At times, half a dozen sign-waving residents stood outside, chanting about government overreach or viral contamination. Her theatrics even reached a local TV station, which, lacking a big story that week, ran a short segment about controversy at Willow Glen quarantine site. To my dismay, the coverage was skewed by Karen's fear-mongering interviews. They quoted her as saying, "I simply want to protect my neighborhood. Why should we be forced to house sick people when there are empty buildings all over the county? Why is the CDC ignoring homeowner rights?" The piece ended by noting that the debate is ongoing, rather than clarifying that the quarantine was an approved and necessary measure. Amid all this turmoil, the majority of the Willow Glen HOA board stood by me, reminding residents that 4 out of 5 voted to allow the quarantine. Karen tried to call an emergency HOA meeting to reverse the vote, but Rick wouldn't permit it, citing that official decisions required a certain procedure and time frame. She seethed. She even confronted Rick in his driveway one morning, shouting, You're letting that so-called doctor ruin everything we've built here." Rick later confessed to me that in 15 years of working with the HOA, he had never seen a resident board member so unhinged. The real turning point came when the local and state governments issued an official extension to the quarantine program, acknowledging that the outbreak, though under control, remained a possible threat for another month. That extension ignited Karen's fury like never before. One breezy Friday morning, I attended a meeting at City Hall with the mayor, local health officials, and a handful of city council members. The purpose was to finalize the extension for the Willow Glen Quarantine Center. My role was to provide data on how many people had been quarantined, how many had tested positive versus negative, and how effectively we had contained new infections. The numbers were on our side. Evidence indicated that these small, local quarantine sites drastically cut transmission rates, which was precisely the CDC's objective. Once the meeting wrapped up, I stepped outside, only to be confronted by Karen and a camera crew from a local news channel. She blocked my path, waving a stack of documents in my face. The reporter held a microphone, capturing Karen's tirade as she launched into a heated diatribe. "This so-called facility is reckless. It's a threat to the residents of Willow Glen. And I have proof that Dr. Alexandra Bishop here is misusing government resources." She stabbed a finger into one of her papers, as though that alone made her claims factual. I forced a calm expression, though my pulse quickened. "Ms. Arnett, please allow me to pass. If you have a legitimate complaint, you can bring it to the city council as you've done, or—" She cut me off. "Legitimate complaint? You've turned our community center into a disease-ridden shelter. I have multiple statements from neighbors who said they never approved this. And property values," she waved her papers wildly. "Look at these projections from a real estate agent friend of mine. They're plummeting." By now, a small crowd had gathered. The reporter, seeing the confrontation, attempted to get a statement from me. My main goal was to avoid being drawn into a sensational shouting match. Taking a deep breath, I faced the camera. The CDC, local health department, and Willow Glen HOA, by majority vote, established a temporary quarantine to contain an infectious disease. Public safety is our top priority. Any claims of misusing resources are unfounded. The facility remains critical to preventing a larger outbreak. Karen tried to interrupt, but the reporter pivoted toward her. "Ms. Arnett, we understand the outbreak has been contained, partly due to the quarantine efforts. Why do you believe the facility is so dangerous?" Seizing her moment of publicity, Karen exclaimed, "We want to keep viruses out. We're not a dumping ground for them. We have a right to refuse. My neighbors feel the same way. Just ask them if they're thrilled about living next to a holding pen for possible disease." It was painful to watch the reporter scribble notes, capturing Karen's angry sound bites. Despite the chaos, I managed to maintain composure, reiterating that city, state, and federal agencies all agreed the center was safe and properly managed. No laws were being broken, but Karen's provocative statements cast a shadow of doubt in the eyes of casual viewers. At last, the standoff ended. Karen stomped away with her makeshift entourage. One city council member, shaking his head, said to me, "I'm sorry you have to deal with that. Please know that we support the quarantine efforts." Grateful for the reassurance, I nodded. Inside, though, I dreaded how Karen's theatrics might further embolden the dissenters. I could handle administrative battles, but this was turning into a personal crusade. Over the next week, things quieted somewhat, but only on the surface. We successfully admitted another round of individuals who needed observation after a small cluster of infections was discovered at a local high school. The rec center once again proved invaluable, freeing up hospital space for more severe cases. To my relief, a good portion of Willow Glen's residents saw the direct benefit. Some even reached out to me with homemade baked goods to show support. Then came the sabotage that nearly broke the entire operation. Karen orchestrated the abrupt closure of the rec center's water supply. The building was reliant on the city's water lines, but the HOA had some oversight on the recreation area's plumbing. Without warning, faucets and toilets stopped working. It turned out someone had tampered with the main water valve near the rec center's utility closet, jamming it shut and damaging the piping, so that turning it back on wasn't a quick fix. This forced us to evacuate half the quarantined individuals, those who could be relocated safely, to the nearest hospital. We had no running water for cleaning, no flushing toilets, and no way to sanitize the facility. The city's water department arrived promptly, but it took them 2 days to fix the damage. Those were 2 critical days of lost functionality for the quarantine center. Temporary chaos ensued as hospital staff scrambled to accommodate the extra patients. Once again, the sabotage had Karen's fingerprint all over it. And once again, when the police arrived to investigate, she feigned ignorance. "Why would I sabotage my own neighborhood property?" she asked with a saccharine smile. But no one believed her innocence anymore. That incident was the last straw for local officials. The mayor's office and the city's legal department announced they were launching an official investigation into the repeated acts of vandalism at the quarantine site, referencing everything from the padlocks to the water supply sabotage. Even if Karen wasn't directly turning the valves, it was clear she was orchestrating these attacks. Around that time, with frustration boiling over, I decided it was time to make use of my position as a chief epidemiologist in a more forceful manner. Up until then, I tried to keep the focus on science and reason, hoping logic would prevail. But if Karen wanted a legal showdown, she was about to get one. I put in a request through CDC channels for additional federal legal support, specifically to protect designated quarantine sites from sabotage under emergency health provisions. If the evidence was strong enough, Karen could face federal charges for interfering with a public health operation. I didn't relish the idea of taking such drastic measures against a neighbor. But Karen had left me, and everyone else, no choice. When the official investigation began, Willow Glen residents witnessed a parade of city attorneys, investigators, and local officials interviewing people about Karen's activities. A sense of tension clouded the usually picturesque streets. Some neighbors were frightened to get involved. Others, like Alicia from the board, were more than willing to provide statements about Karen's behavior, especially regarding the sabotage she all but confessed to in their presence. Meanwhile, Karen remained defiant. She posted a tirade on the neighborhood forum. "I stand for the rights of Willow Glen. I'm being persecuted for protecting my home. The CDC has no business waging war on a suburban community. If that's a crime, then arrest me." Her arrogance seemed unbounded. She was daring the authorities to hold her accountable. She organized a town hall in her front yard, inviting local news stations. Only one small blog showed up, and proclaiming she had secret evidence that the rec center was unsafe. None of it had any legitimate basis, of course, but she banked on sensational headlines and paranoia to carry her message. While all this unfolded, I continued my daily routine at the quarantine center. Despite the sabotage, we'd stabilized operations. The city had replaced the water pipes and installed extra locks, cameras, and an alarm system. We even stationed an off-duty officer in a small side office to guard the building at night. I was in my office near the back of the rec center, finalizing paperwork for a new group of quarantined individuals, when Rick Walters knocked softly on my door. He looked pale. "Alex," he said quietly, "I just came from a meeting with Karen and the board." He let out a slow breath, as if the confrontation had rattled him. "She's threatening to sue the entire HOA if we don't revoke the quarantine. She's citing everything from property devaluation to emotional distress." I folded my arms, feeling my jaw tighten. "Does she even have a real case?" He shook his head. "Probably not. But she's stirring up more fear. And, well, some folks on the board are getting nervous. Legal fees can be huge." I nodded slowly, understanding the board's dilemma. HOAs typically run on limited budgets. A drawn-out lawsuit, even if frivolous, could be financially draining. Still, we had to stand firm. "Rick, the city and the CDC have authorized this. If the board caves, the outbreak risk could worsen. People's lives matter more than legal intimidation." He grimaced. "I know. I do. But Alicia is on edge. Her family can't afford big legal battles. Marcus is supportive, but the situation is wearing him down too. Nancy remains a voice of reason, but she's older, and the stress is getting to her." I gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "If it helps, the city's legal department will back the HOA. This is bigger than Willow Glen. I'll do everything I can to ensure the HOA isn't left alone to fight her." Rick exhaled, relief flickering in his eyes. "Thank you, Alex. You're doing so much already." Little did he know, behind the scenes, the city's investigation was ramping up, gathering all the testimonies about Karen's sabotage. I had a feeling that once they compiled everything, Karen's threats of lawsuits would pale in comparison to what the city might bring against her. True to my suspicions, about a week later, the city issued a preliminary notice indicating that they had sufficient grounds to file civil and possibly criminal charges against Karen. The official documents outlined her involvement in unauthorized closure attempts, property damage, and interference with public health operations under state and federal statutes. It was essentially a cease and desist, demanding she immediately stop all sabotage and intimidation efforts. If she continued, they warned, the next step would be formal charges. When news of the cease and desist spread, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Some were thrilled. Finally, accountability, they said. Others felt sorry for Karen, bizarrely painting her as a kind of misguided hero. But the effect was immediate. Karen's antics slowed. She stopped loitering around the rec center. The late-night vandalism halted. The moment the threat of legal repercussions seemed tangible, her bravado receded. However, it wasn't quite finished. Karen might have slowed her sabotage, but she was still fueling the rumor mill. She told neighbors that she was being witch-hunted by me and the city. She threatened to hold a mass demonstration outside the rec center. She posted dramatic updates on social media about how the world was against her. In short, she thrived on any attention, positive or negative. Yet, ironically, many of her previous supporters became distant once they realized the seriousness of her actions. During this lull, the quarantine center functioned without interference for the first time in weeks. We admitted a few new individuals from a secondary outbreak at a local retirement complex. They stayed the required days, tested negative, and were released. All signs pointed to the outbreak finally receding, thanks to concerted measures across the city. For once, I dared to hope that the worst was behind us. Maybe Karen would back off for good. Then, on a cool autumn evening, everything escalated to an unexpected climax that none of us could have predicted. It happened late on a Wednesday, when I was preparing to wrap up the day's work. Only a handful of medical staff remained in the rec center. Suddenly, an alarm blared near the facility's side entrance. I rushed over, heart pounding. The newly installed alarm system indicated a forced entry. I expected to find Karen or one of her minions. Instead, I discovered a man brandishing a crowbar, trying to break into the locked storage area. He was no neighbor I recognized. He wore a dark hoodie and was rummaging through supplies, looking panicked. Officer Martinez, stationed at the center, dashed forward with her weapon drawn, commanding the intruder to drop the crowbar. A tense standoff ensued, ending when backup arrived and the man surrendered. We later discovered that this wasn't Karen's sabotage. This was a desperate break-in by someone unrelated, apparently hoping to steal medical supplies to sell. But the real surprise was that Karen, ironically, had witnessed the incident from outside and, to her credit, called 911. She had been lurking around the premises, again, presumably to gather evidence of some wrongdoing she could blame on me. But she ended up seeing the intruder enter forcibly. She phoned the authorities, who rushed to the scene. The next morning, local news outlets reported that a break-in had been foiled at the Willow Glen Quarantine Center, ironically with the help of concerned neighbor Ms. Arnett. Karen seized the moment to rebrand herself as some heroic figure who had saved the facility from a dangerous criminal, conveniently ignoring the fact she had tried to shut that same facility down at every turn. She gave interviews describing how she was protecting the neighborhood by calling the police. When asked why she was near the rec center late at night, she lied. I just happened to be walking my dog and saw something suspicious. Meanwhile, we all knew she was likely prowling for more dirt to use against me. The entire charade left me both relieved. The intruder was caught before he hurt anyone, and irritated, Karen was spinning the incident into a redemption story. But, in a twisted way, her involvement signaled that she might be pivoting tactics again, trying to appear cooperative to avoid the looming legal threats. I only hoped that the city's investigation would proceed with or without her attempt to rewrite history. As autumn turned to early winter, signs of the outbreak diminished. Public health bulletins declared that the virus was largely contained. Most newly discovered cases were mild, and community transmission was low. Consequently, the local government announced that by mid-December, they planned to decommission the quarantine center at Willow Glen, as it would no longer be needed. Everyone breathed a collective sigh of relief. Amid this hopeful news, the question of Karen's accountability still hung in the air. I wondered if the city would press charges. Rick Walters confided that her intimidation of the board, along with documented sabotage, was enough to consider removing her from her position on the HOA entirely. In the end, it would be up to a vote by the association's membership, requiring the board to gather written statements and organize a formal meeting to propose her removal. Another neighbor told me Karen had gone uncharacteristically quiet about the quarantine site since the break-in fiasco. No more petitions, no more fear-mongering flyers, no more broken valves or cut power lines. It was as if she was lying low. Meanwhile, the quarantine center gradually phased out operations. On the second week of December, we transferred the last 2 individuals who had tested negative home. A small farewell gathering took place, with staff members hugging, relieved to have successfully concluded a challenging assignment. No one contracted the virus from the facility itself, proving that our protocols worked. For me, it was a moment of profound relief. I met with the city health director to sign final documents relinquishing the rec center back to the sole control of the HOA. And just like that, my official role as manager of the Willow Glen quarantine ended. Still, the aftershock of Karen's meddling lingered. While the quarantine was over, the ramifications were not. A week later, an official letter arrived at my home from the local district attorney's office. It requested my presence at a hearing related to the quarantine sabotage. Karen was the primary person of interest, accused of orchestrating or abetting criminal mischief against a government-approved medical site. At last, a formal process was underway. Simultaneously, the Willow Glen HOA board scheduled a special membership meeting to vote on removing Karen from her position. Flyers were posted throughout the neighborhood, stating the reason plainly: misconduct and repeated violation of HOA regulations while interfering with a public health facility. The meeting was set for one evening in late December, presumably after the city hearing. The board made sure to follow every procedural step meticulously, so Karen could not challenge it on technical grounds. I soon learned that Karen had retained a lawyer, one who specialized in property disputes. She intended to fight both the city's charges and the HOA's push for her removal. A part of me dreaded the possibility that her attorney might try to spin everything or draw out the legal proceedings indefinitely. But I also knew the evidence was substantial. Karen had left a glaring trail of documentation behind. When the hearing day arrived, I dressed in formal attire and made my way to the municipal courthouse. The small courtroom was abuzz with attorneys, witnesses, and a few curious onlookers. Karen sat at a table with her lawyer, wearing a stark black blazer. Her expression was somber, but she still managed to look haughty, as if this entire spectacle was beneath her. The hearing began with the prosecution outlining Karen's involvement in vandalism and sabotage: the padlocks, the water valve tampering, the rummage supply rooms. They cited testimonies from neighbors who had seen her orchestrate these acts or encouraging others to do so. They read out incident reports from the police. In each instance, Karen's involvement, if not direct, then conspiratorial, was highlighted. Karen's lawyer countered that there was no definitive video evidence placing Ms. Arnett at the scene of each sabotage act, dismissing eyewitness accounts as hearsay. He claimed Karen's protests were within her rights as a homeowner protecting property values, painting her as a champion of free speech. He even suggested that the city's frustration with her was more about silencing a vocal dissenter than punishing wrongdoing. Throughout the back and forth, I stayed composed, answering questions calmly about the quarantine's purpose, how sabotage threatened public health, and my direct observations of Karen's hostility. When the lawyer tried to rattle me, insinuating that the CDC had ulterior motives for placing a quarantine site in a suburban neighborhood, I responded with factual data and a calm tone. He seemed irritated that I didn't get flustered. After hours of testimony, the judge concluded that there was sufficient evidence to proceed with formal charges against Karen for malicious interference with a public health operation, though not all sabotage incidents could be pinned on her without further evidence. This meant the legal process would move to the next stage, where Karen could face fines or even jail time if found guilty in a full trial. The final verdict would come later, but for now, it was a firm statement. Karen was not untouchable. A few evenings later, the Willow Glen HOA membership meeting took place in the rec center itself, its original function as a neighborhood hall restored. Despite the cold weather outside, the hall was packed with residents eager to cast their votes. Karen sat on one side, flanked by a handful of supporters, looking tense. Rick Walters opened the meeting, giving a measured summary of Karen's extensive disregard for HOA regulations, repeated harassment of staff, and sabotage of the community property. He pointed out that the investigation and hearing had made it clear her actions went well beyond a simple difference of opinion. Alicia and Marcus each gave testimonies of how Karen had bullied them or threatened frivolous lawsuits to coerce them. Nancy spoke softly but firmly, reminding everyone that Willow Glen had always prided itself on cooperation and community spirit, values Karen had seemingly disregarded. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she stood, cleared her throat, and launched into a rehearsed plea. I have always had Willow Glen's best interests at heart. Yes, I was passionate, but only because I care about our property values and the safety of our children. The supposed sabotage is nothing but a smear campaign. If you vote me out, you are letting a wave of outside interests and the CDC take over our neighborhood. Her words sounded hollow. The majority of residents knew by then that the quarantine center had helped curb a serious outbreak, and that Karen's sabotage had been reckless at best, criminal at worst. When the membership took a written vote, by secret ballot, per HOA bylaws, Karen's removal was nearly unanimous. Only a handful of votes opposed it, presumably her close friends or those easily swayed by fear-mongering. When Rick announced the result, by a vote of 87-5, Ms. Arnett is hereby removed from the board. A hush fell over the hall. Karen stood there, her jaw tight, her face reddening. Then, with a dramatic flourish, she scoffed, turned on her heel, and marched out the door, refusing to acknowledge anyone. A few of her supporters followed, but the majority stayed behind, relieved that the ordeal was concluding. In the days that followed, Karen's presence in Willow Glen dwindled. She no longer harassed me about trash cans or yard maintenance. In fact, I rarely saw her at all. One neighbor said she was putting her house up for sale, though that remained unconfirmed. As for the city's legal case, it continued, but her immediate control over neighborhood matters had dissolved. With the new year approaching, a sense of renewal washed over Willow Glen. The holiday season had come and gone, overshadowed by the lingering drama of the quarantine. Now, people put up cheerful winter decorations, children built snowmen on front lawns, and families sipped hot cocoa while planning for the coming year. It felt as though a collective weight had been lifted. The phrase, "Karen's not on the board anymore," became almost a local punchline, evoking relieved chuckles. I, too, finally allowed myself to relax. There were no urgent calls from the CDC, no pressing outbreak in the immediate area. Though I remained on standby for future public health emergencies, for now, at least, I could focus on a more typical daily routine. I spent time refurbishing an old library table in my garage workshop and even joined a neighborhood book club that Alicia organized, something I would have laughed at months earlier when all I knew was conflict and strife. One evening, I was walking Gibson near the rec center. The building was back to hosting yoga classes, scout meetings, and birthday parties. Observing it, I felt a wave of satisfaction. We had successfully transformed that space into a lifeline during a public health crisis, despite everything Karen had done to sabotage it. The outbreak was contained, and the neighborhood was intact. As I turned to head home, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Officer Martinez. "Wanted to let you know, City is finalizing charges. Karen's lawyer is pushing for a plea deal. She might avoid a trial if she agrees to pay restitution. We'll keep you posted." I read the text twice, absorbing the news. So the once arrogant Karen, who claimed she'd done nothing wrong, was now seeking a deal to avoid the public spectacle of a trial. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity. If she had only cooperated from the start, or at least voiced her concerns in a constructive manner, none of this would have happened. But that was the path she chose. True to Officer Martinez's message, Karen accepted a plea deal that involved a hefty fine for property damage and an admission of wrongdoing in exchange for dropping certain charges. The city announced the outcome in a brief press release, noting that while her actions were extremely reckless, the case was resolved without a protracted courtroom battle. Karen was required to pay restitution to the Willow Glen HOA for damages caused during the sabotage. She also had to issue a written apology to the neighborhood. Many suspected it was drafted by her lawyer, but it was something of a gesture, if not genuine remorse. In that apology, she acknowledged that she had acted in ways that were not consistent with Willow Glen's community spirit and that she regretted any harm caused. It was short, lacking any personal warmth, but it at least put an official close to the matter. Rumor had it that she planned to move to a different suburb, possibly to start fresh where people wouldn't know her reputation. With the fiasco finally behind us, Willow Glen moved forward. The HOA board appointed an interim member to fill Karen's seat until the next election. Meetings became more cordial, focusing on holiday decoration contests and plans to upgrade the community pool. Nobody missed the drama. When I stopped by the HOA's monthly gathering, this time for a friendly chat rather than a high-stakes debate, Rick Walters thanked me with genuine warmth in his voice. "Alex," he said, clapping me on the shoulder, "I don't know how we could have managed without you. You showed incredible patience and did the neighborhood proud, even when Karen was at her worst." I smiled. "Thank you, Rick. I just did my job, both as a neighbor and a doctor. I'm glad Willow Glen came through it all right." He nodded with a relieved grin. "We sure did." Spring arrived in Willow Glen, a gentle renewal after the tumultuous past year. Flowers bloomed in carefully tended front yards, and the creek by the neighborhood edge sparkled under the sun. Kids who had once been cooped up due to outbreak concerns were now out riding bikes and tossing frisbees on the greenbelt. The rec center bustled with yoga classes, seniors playing bingo, and the occasional craft fair. Life felt stable and calm, exactly the suburban dream I'd sought when I first moved here. One Saturday morning, I was in my front yard planting a few new rose bushes. Across the street, Alicia waved at me while jogging, her dog trotting happily behind. She gave me a thumbs up, signifying her excitement that our once contentious neighborhood was settling into a comfortable routine. Marcus drove by, honking cheerfully, presumably heading to the hardware store. My old friend Nancy from the board paused during her walk to say hello, her eyes bright, grateful for the more peaceful environment. That evening, I hosted a small barbecue in my backyard, inviting neighbors who had become friends: Rick, Alicia, Marcus, Nancy, and a few others. We grilled burgers and veggie kebabs, shared stories, and laughed about how the winter had been overshadowed by Karen's reign of terror. Now, though, it was almost like a memory from a distant life. When we toasted marshmallows over the fire pit, Rick pulled me aside for a moment. "You know, Alex," he said quietly, "there was a time I wondered if I made a mistake approving that quarantine center. There was so much hostility from Karen, so much tension. But looking at how things turned out, I'm convinced we did the right thing." I smiled softly. "Me too. At the end of the day, we saved lives and proved that communities can come together, even if some folks do everything they can to tear them apart." He nodded, thoughtful. "Karen tried to sabotage us all, but ironically she proved the strength of this neighborhood. We stuck by you, and each other, through it all." As the night wore on, I felt an immense sense of gratitude. The fiasco with Karen had tested me in ways I never expected, balancing my role as a CDC epidemiologist with being a simple resident in a close-knit suburb. It challenged Willow Glen, too, shining a spotlight on the fragility and resilience of community bonds. But in the end, despite all the sabotage, legal battles, and personal attacks, goodness and reason had triumphed. No major outbreak had decimated the neighborhood. No unscrupulous saboteur had escaped accountability. Now, the rec center was back to hosting neighborhood gatherings, no longer overshadowed by fear or rumor. Standing there in my backyard, under a sky full of stars, I could almost forget the trials of the past months. For all the petty rules and the microdrama that HOAs can bring, I saw firsthand the solidarity that can blossom in even the most seemingly uniform suburbs. A few neighbors raised their cups for one final toast. We toasted to health, to safety, and to each other, a testament that even Karen couldn't break our collective spirit. And as I lay my head down that night, lulled by the chirping crickets outside my window, I felt a glow of satisfaction. Willow Glen Estates was no longer just a place I lived. It was a place I belonged, a place that had weathered a storm and come out stronger and more unified on the other side.